Thank you, Joe, for joining us and the people online for our ACAP presentation. Joe lives in Perth Hills and in recent years has worked on the literature of rivers and theory of deep mapping. The book, 4 Rivers, Deep Maps, Collected Responses on Rivers from the Perth region, Australia, and Aberdeenshire in Scotland, was published in 2022. And Joe's now going to go through that with us and talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. And I was just excited that people like Linda exist in the university and get stuff ready for us. And it's so much easier than normal lectures, turning up and wrangling tech. So thank you so much. And giving this paper today, I've been to so many different physical, psychological, emotional, intellectual places with my whole journey with deep mapping, about looking at places through various lenses that are slightly different to my background in traditional literary studies, and thinking about how to reframe my relationship with written texts, artistic texts, and my relationship to place as well, and how to kind of convey that in particular critical ways. I've focused less on sort of the theory of water and the theory of rivers in this paper because there's a lot to go through. However, having said that, because I realised that people, I'm sure nobody actually goes for an hour and a half in these papers, because it was such a long amount of time, I thought I'll use it talking about my favourite thing, arranging the kind of material I've got in a particular way, which is to talk about me and my own journey through these different places and why I have sort of come to this particular moment in my pursuit of deep mapping as both a research output, but also as a way of thinking and feeling about place. You just also, if anybody has, I know Susanna and Tony were involved in the book project, the deep mapping project. If anybody wants to interject or ask questions or anything like that, please, I'm really happy for this to be quite informal. I've been kind of a bit reclusive lately. I haven't been particularly well, so I'm a bit nervous. So if anybody wants to say, Joe, that bit was amazing, or I really loved what you did there, keep going, you're just a mate, so good at your work. Yeah, do things like that. No, nothing critical though, so yeah. I chose this picture to start with by Christopher Pearce because it's a very sort of, in its aesthetic tradition, a very Western piece of artwork. And it, of course, focuses, one of its foci is the roundhouse. And I think that means that, you know, that's this idea of settlement as a kind of containment, a kind of incarceration. And then we see this representation of the wargle, of course, the creator spirit, the snake creator spirit of the Swan Basin, which has all these stories associated with it, of course, in Noongar culture. But what I think is fascinating is that I never looked back, or I never looked at this place differently once I thought about a snake as a creator spirit. And being somebody that kind of grew up in the set that kind of, you know, the outer suburbs in the bush, you just see, when you see snakes really often, how amazing their energy is and how their prehensile movement kind of springs and coils and the kind of variety of movement and shape that they have. And of course, because the way that water works in Perth, and you know, that rivers are something that we imagine in our European ways of seeing things to go across the top of the water. In Perth, we're so much based on sand and limestone that we have underground water, overground water, swamps and different patterns of water that are not just the river, but they're patterns of sand dunes and swamps that go up and down the coastal plain as well. And the more I've connected with, certainly in only very kind of early ways with Indigenous culture, but with actual geographical information about Perth And my own kind of memories and spatialised activities to do with the everydayness of living in Perth, the more I've thought about this idea of deep mapping and the connections that we can make through it. I don't know if anyone, this is not a Australian image, it's by a British artist and photographer. Does anybody know this image? Okay, so that's fine. It was made in it was taken in the 40s or 1938, and it's by Paul Nash, and it's called Monster Field. So Paul Nash is mainly known as a war artist, but he went on to make some very surreal images after his period as kind of through both wars, sort of becoming incredibly famous through having scenes with aircraft in them and lots of other similar types of things. They're his most well-known pieces. But when he made Monster Field, what he was looking towards investigating is the idea that just out of sight, in a place that is really familiar and really ubiquitous, there are strange things. And so what this is, of course, is a tree that has fallen onto another tree, and, you know, depending on what your imagination tells you to think, that it can look a little bit like a bird's head, it can look like a strange legged creature, but really it's this sense that this everyday thing could be anywhere. And in fact, lurking in our everydayness are strange things that we don't take notice of, and things that are sort of hiding in plain sight. And this is the text that accompanied this image. He said, "Monster Field, when, where, over there to the left, the next field beyond the hedge, it was always the same, always elusive and ubiquitous." And a friend of mine, Lucy Dugan, she wrote a poem and has a poetry collection called Monster Field, so she's a Perth-based poet. And I'll just read the first section of this book. Now, her version of Monster Field is about the Royal Perth Hospital, and it's where she continually had to attend when she had cancer a few years back that she's now recovered from. And she knew it as a child because both of her parents were doctors and worked there. So Monster Field, can the view from a building still contain a skyline that is lost? I think it can. And that's exactly how I feel about this idea of deep mapping, which is become a globally really powerful way of curating artistic exhibitions, of editing works of poetry and prose together, which is of course what I've done in a book. But at the same time, it's about looking beyond space as something that's connected to time in a linear way through events. It's about looking at space being connected to time in a way that times coexist, very post-Einsteinian ideas of how time works. So basically I've been obsessed with this as a theme through most of my intellectual life, and my first book, which is about historical fiction and about moments of contact and frontier conflict, I was obsessed with the idea of reevaluating worldviews by the idea of falling backwards, and that's how I saw reevaluating history within the knowledge of settler colonial contact. And I was very much influenced by this artist called Lindsay Sears, and I was living in Tasmania. She was at, she had an exhibition at Mona, and you had to walk through this upturned vessel, like this vehicle. And of course, as we imagine all the times of settler colonialism, of people coming to Australia from many different places as migrants, but in those particularly early years from England and Ireland, and often themselves forced migrants, convicts, that I felt thinking in that way, taking into account very different ideas of history, was like a falling backwards, like an immersion in water and kind of drowning, and kind of being overwhelmed by a past that is suddenly starting to encroach on your present while you kind of rearrange the idea of who you are, where you belong, and the place you inhabit. And she had this fantastic story. So this is when you see these two strange eyes. She had this fantastic story of Lindsay Sears herself has like David Bowie, has a green eye and a green and a blue eye, I think it is, yeah. And so what one of her metaphors was that basically how this particular type of, like most people that have different colours eyes, one of them just gets hit in the eye, so something like have some kind of eye injury. These people are born like this, so it's genetic. And basically what it does mean is that they started off in embryo as a twin, and then one twin has subsumed to the other twin as, you know, the child has started to grow in the womb. So the one eye's always got somebody else's DNA. And I think that's what history in the past is like for us. It's so close to us. It's in our DNA. It's in our ancestors and live through us in their DNA. And we might think that we know them, but we really have no idea. History is so utterly strange to us in the ways that lives were lived, that we're not used to seeing them. In the same way that we're not used to seeing so many things that are in plain sight, whether it's connections between different types of environmental, you know, aspects, the way that the environment itself interacts more than we imagine it to, the way that so many different aspects of our material existence are so much more closely enmeshed and intertwined than we ever expect them to be. So that was my first big, the falling backwards was my first metaphor that I became quite obsessed with in dealing with the past. And when I came to the idea of deep mapping and moved away from kind of historical fiction, I became obsessed with this idea of seismic movement and liquefaction. Because again, you know, I think these ideas can change us so deeply and intrinsically as people that they can affect the self in really interesting ways. And that I thought that what I was thinking about deep mapping was so, and particularly Bruno Latour's idea of actor network theory. So all these non-human elements of an environment, whether it's the water, whether it's, you know, the silt that exists between a river, whether it's, you know, sandstone or limestone, or whether it's trees or animals, or whether it's the sky or the creatures in the sky, and every living aspect or a non-living aspect of the world has different types of sentience that we aren't used to recognising. And in some times it can move in ways that we don't expect. I happened to be in Wellington. Tony and Pear, did you ever go to that ASIL conference in Wellington when there was an earthquake during the time? So tiny little earthquake that, you know, people in New Zealand wouldn't think twice about. I mean, it was reported in Australia and all of our family rang up and my sister was there too and said, "Are you okay?" And we're like, we were fine, but it was really weird. And it was, I remember walking across the room and to start with, we thought someone next door had like a washing machine on, but it felt like it was, the room all of a sudden wasn't solid anymore. The ground beneath your feet wasn't solid and we were like walking on a wave and we're like, what's going on here? And it was kind of funny and terrifying at the same time. And if anybody knows Lars von Trier's Melancholia, it starts off with this process of liquefaction because it is about, you know, the connection between melancholia and depression and the idea of, you know, annihilation. And I have got a link here, but I might leave it because it's really depressing. And does anyone want to watch it? Yeah, it's from the very start. No. I thought I'll add a film in because it might be quite interesting. And then I'm like, Joe, you're already anxious, so you might go totally psycho. All right, so I've only ever seen this movie once, like most Lars von Trier movies. Once is enough. You don't want to do that to yourself more than once. But yeah, there is this kind of idea of liquefaction, and everything that you feel existed doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And I feel like that's been my journey of scholarship, that it has been so deeply intrinsically changing in terms of who I see as myself and how I interact with my environment, which is a much more sentient environment than I ever imagined in my earlier years, in the happy days, before I got knowledge and became old and strange. Okay, so just to go back to some basics, deep mapping, what is it? And GIS and digital mapping. Now, I really wanted to talk about, you know, the projects that I've attempted to begin, some of which have come to something, some of which I'm still hoping will gain funding at some point and I can do something with. But basically, deep mapping is really intrinsically connected to the fact that we've started to visualise place in ways that are more three-dimensional because of changes in technology. Now, this feels totally alien to me. I am not a technology person. So if anyone has any suggestions, I just want to say that my notes for papers usually look like that. I actually find it hard to type up ideas. I'm much better to write ideas. And I feel really deeply pissed off that I've become a really good blackboard technician. That was not my life's goal. Like, I'm just annoyed about that. I'm like, I didn't sign up for this. I've signed up to do this kind of stuff, not fart about making sure links work. So anyway, I'm sure that, you know, there's lots of nods of, I get you, Joe. I don't like that stuff either. So anyway, deep mapping is about looking at things, and this is the way I see it, through altered dimensionality and deep time. So most of you, I'm sure, know what deep time is, but it's looking at time in geographical scales, not in the general historical scales that we think of things in. In Australia, we tend to think of things in decades, then in through big events like wars, through centuries, through and of course our pre and post colonisation moments, and we divide up history in that way. And of course that's just a ridiculous idea in so many ways, like nothing had changed or developed, or that there was nothing that happened here before the arrival, or before 1010? Yes, I was thinking 1066, but I was getting my invasions mixed up. But, you know, I did mean 17. So, yeah, it's this sense that, of course, you know, the Anthropocene itself is much more complex than that. It's about much larger timescales, and looking particularly from 1945 onwards, that post-nuclear age, just the very makeup of the Earth itself has changed because of the human presence and human technology. So I also want to talk about, this is like a little thing of a little précis of what's in the presentation, relationality in non-human worlds. A big project that I embarked on, which was a DECRA grant, which was unsuccessful, but certainly was useful in terms of thinking through the ideas of deep mapping water and rivers. I wanted to talk about directions of literary studies and digital interfaces, and then a smaller project, which is probably something that I can manage more without the kind of massive funding of some kind of ARC grant or a DECRA grant. Okay, so this is a very dense slide, but this is, I'll read the very first part out. And this is what deep mapping is. It's an inherently multidisciplinary approach to place that, I'll just move that up, conveys a vitally different experience of location, an approach that diverges profoundly to many modern modes of inhabitation. To deep map is to focus in depth on specific sites and regions, as Pearson and Shanks aptly put it. To express it pays attention to the patina of place. It at once invokes the ambiguous, the haptic, the opaque, the embodied, and the in-between. So the deep mapper is in search of crucial connections between lived experience of specific environments to cultural practice and histories in moving sinuous strands. It seeks what Tim Ingold calls the meshwork that binds place and inhabitation, the flow of space-time between material phenomenon and vestigial and often amorphous traces of human and non-human habitation. And I'll just leave it there. So it is, like I said earlier, a really interesting way of connecting to places that you encounter every day that are part of your own kind of memoryscape as an individual, but also as a culture. And also, it's about, there is something slightly spooky about it, I think, because it's not part of our sort of enlightenment selves. It's not part of our own modernity and our structures of modernity. It's about things that are hidden away, that are a part of emotional complexities and embodied and emotional responses that we don't have the necessary frameworks for in our particular modern ways of theorising human experience. So some more little things, and I'm happy to email this to anyone if people want more little quotes about different things to do with deep mapping and spatial engagements. But one of the main things about them is they're meant to be non-hierarchical and palimpsestic. So, you know, that you can have in anything that you see as a deep map, whether it's a collection of artistic works or visual arts works, whether it's something to do with film or sound recordings, whether it is, I think a lot of poetry and literary work as it is already a deep map. It doesn't mean to be collected to be the deep map. It already does all of these things, but it arranges things in non-hierarchical ways. So it makes room for different ways of seeing the world, whether they are to do with Indigenous worldviews or culturally diverse worldviews, or worldviews that are to do with the primary presence of non-human entities, like these types of things. So anyway, right, just so that's, you know, that's my book. You can still buy it from UWAP. It's quite reasonably priced for an academic thing, $40. And if you like click on it and wait for 10 minutes, they'll offer you a 10% discount. So you get $4 off. Now, I just included this because I thought Susanna's piece that was included, Susanna Castleton right there, she's hiding and looking like, don't say anything. She did a bike ride that she then represented in this map, and she wrote an accompanying piece with it. And because we're looking at these connections, we compared deep mapping process in Scotland with people I've been working with and people in Perth. And the rivers in Scotland are the Don and Dee rivers. So Susanna found Don and Dee streets in Perth and rode past them and made a map. And so there was this kind of very everyday, but a very kind of haptic, you know, and interesting experience where you would go to places where you didn't want to go that you might not usually go because of the particular project. And I remember driving up on various phases. I just drove up. I find the upper Swan really, like as it goes up through the Swan Valley, really interesting because it's got the most bizarre combination of man-made structures. Some of them are really grotesque, like there's one gateway with kind of massive bare-breasted sphinxes. There's other ones with, you know, the gateway is a big thing. Like knights from a chess, you know, 2 knights from a chess thing. They've got names of restaurants like Albion, so they're really English or they're... And Susanna, I always wondered, and I was thinking about this, did you find anything really bizarrely sort of unexpected or... Yeah.
So I was going on this ride
Yeah, a long ride. Yeah.
It was just this everything that was familiar is now because of that embodied atmospheric.
Yeah.
Whole atmosphere. Unusualness.
So there is I think there is this uncanniness, like it's familiar but unfamiliar, and that's something that is deeply part of the deep mapping experience.
So they on the river or in?
They're on West Swan Road. So if you go like up past, there's a really beautiful little church that's on the other side of the Quarry Amphitheatre, on the other side of the Swan. It's quite a picturesque kind of line of the Swan, and there are the strangest juxtapositions there, because I don't know if anyone's been to that new Mandoon estate, which takes that Indigenous word Mandoon, but on the other side of the Mandoon estate, which is kind of quite grotesquely sort of ostentatious, there's Bandyup Prison, and that's really eastern suburbs to me. That's a really eastern suburbs, Upper Swan juxtaposition. So yeah, they're on West Swan Road. So the further you go south, the further you go from town to Guildford, there's this strangeness of these there are these kind of fantasy spaces that people have made, whether they're kind of equestrian centres or they're kind of reception centres for weddings. Anyway, I think one of the things about deep mapping is that it really arose as a phenomenon, and of course it had precursors. It had books like Wolf Willow in the 60s, and it had, there were lots of American precursors, and William Heath Least Moon was a writer that wrote about various kind of road trips in America and looked at very specifically at counties and sort of the everydayness in the history of accounting and how well people knew their land and all these types of things. But certainly it kind of flourished as this idea of connecting with place in all these different ways at the same time as new forms of digital mapping came out. And as I say, that I found them all really interesting. I find digital maps interesting because I find place interesting, and I find them interesting just as a very instrumental way of getting from one place to another and seeing a stone circle or reading a story of a particular. Ian McKellen does this amazing walk, like a story walk in the theatres of London and things like that. There's things like that everywhere now. These very kind of tourist-driven walks. But deep mapping is more than that. And this is a really interesting quote. So because we're in an ACAT presentation, I thought this was important. So with deep mapping, there is a more formal and interactive rationale underpinning what digital and open access publication between the textuality of writing and that of other media, whether it be photographic or moving images, digital maps, audio and sound files, digital and digitised artworks, locative media, hypertext data and other publications and so on. Deep mapping, in short, is largely a product of the digital age. And this is a really good example of what's happened when people have got large parts of, large kind of caches or different types of data, entered them into a database and then tried to map them. So the University of Lancaster did these really interesting ones where they found people's walking journals, like Samuel Coleridge and Thomas Gray. And they looked at every time they'd used words like good, beautiful, sublime, and you can't actually read it here because it's too small. But if you want to go and look, this is the link. It's Mapping the Lakes. So they've used kind of colour splodges to check out of all of the people that did lake walking diaries, what were the commonly used words for different areas. So it becomes like a poetic emotional map of effective responses to place. And that's one of the ways that digital mapping and literature have really crossed over. And particularly with anything that you can enter in a lot of data and the data will bring out a map. So whether it's looking for words that describe emotions in a walking journal, or looking at other types of written text that you can use to then map responses to place. And they've got heaps of them. They've looked at Wordsworth poetry. They've looked at many, many different literary productions that are in the lakes. Of course, WA is really different to that. We don't have this kind of massive romantic moment where everybody comes to Perth and all of the best poets of the age get together and write journals of walking in place. We have very different types of text that we can assess. There's many other digital maps, and I won't go through them because I don't want to take up heaps of time, but one of the most interesting is the Colonial Frontiers Massacre map, where, here we go. You can see all of the different massacres. This comes out of the University of Newcastle. And if you want to figure out basically a map of colonisation, all you have to do is do this. Okay, so 1800, 10 more years, more, 1830, and of course it just traces the history of settlement and colonisation, and then by the time you get up to 1930, you just have a sense of the extent of colonial massacres of Indigenous people. So, you know, there's so many interesting ways to use digital maps in the humanities, and these are ones I've used either as something that I shared at conferences. I always use the Argus software, which, don't make me do that. I should have done that earlier, and I can never remember my Facebook password. No. All right, so this is just one map that I've made. I've made heaps of different ones. I made one in Perth that traced the main events of Cloud Street. I made...
Showing online, sharing through WebEx.
Fiddle around next to me, go for it. Ooh.
Sorry.
So yeah, this is one that the first one I ever made, and it's in the town of Ross in Tasmania. And I had this idea because I was going through this mad ghost story fixation, and I was teaching people in a Master of Education in English, and I just wanted to show how you could use spaces to really teach things about genre. And Ross is this tiny little town on the highway in between Launceston and Hobart. And so really what I did is I pinned all these places in this very kind of low-tech way using satellite technology. So GIS is in the software I use called Argus. The GIS is like the satellite technology where you can pin texts.
To close it down to like get it.
Okay.
But then I don't know that you can open it again, so that's sorry.
Thank you. I won't be long. Basically what happened is I just gave people, as if they were students in a classroom, activities that they had to do at every point in this funny little town in Tasmania. So many of you know, well, that Tasmania basically went into this economic freeze after their free labour went away, you know, their convicts went away. And so they haven't had the kind of same kind of modern development in a lot of places of Tasmania as other parts of Australia. And this is still basically a town as big as it was in its heyday in sort of the 1870s when they stopped having convict labour. And, you know, this is the location of a female factory and all these different things, but they're all ruins. So what I did is I looked at the crossroads and I'm like, this reminds me of a medieval town. It's so little, it's got a church on each corner. And so I made things to do with Hecate and the crossroad. It had all these stimulus tasks about witches and everything to do with the crossroads, and they had to make up either a ghost story or a ghosty poem like Double, Double, Toil and Trouble from Macbeth. Then when you go to other places, and as I was making this map and walking around Ross, I started feeling really different things. And up at the top of the hill, there's the Uniting Church. And at that moment, I started to feel, I was steeped in kind of Lovecraft and Stephen King, and I was looking at all these different elements of horror in the American Northwest. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that the layout of this town was basically, it was paranoid. You know, that there was this paranoid layout of the landscape where you could go on top of the hill and you could see everything for miles around. So if they were worried about being attacked by, you know, local tribal groups, which they absolutely, you know, would have been before they had, of course, you know, about the Black Line when they tried to wipe out people and you know, capture and remove and replace Indigenous people in Tasmania, that there is this sense of terror just in the landscape itself and the way that they've made a town in the landscape. There was this strange sort of combination of looking at that kind of anxiety in American texts and looking at anxiety in this Australian place. And I started to realise what I was doing was actually a form of psychogeography, and then I became interested in that. So anyway, so there's so many of these maps, and I've come through it through teaching. So I submitted what I thought was reasonably good, big, it's probably too good to get the money, and that's what I tell myself all the time. This was so good, no one would give it any money, bastards. But anyway, it was looking at deep mapping as a critical literary methodology. So it was looking at connecting text to places along the two rivers, and then using the proximity of the text and looking at other closed details between, for instance, Randolph Stowe's autobiographical texts at Guildford Grammar and the other texts that have been written in, and there's not heaps, but there's been poetry texts by Dorothy Hewitt, by people like Nandi Chinna, by James Quinton, by lots of other people that have written about that section of the river, and looking at the spatial arrangement of them and thinking about that as a kind of critical way of reevaluating the way that we look at literary histories and the kind of cultural landscape of a place that's to do with the kind of texts that were made there. So really, the second part of this, and this might not be of interest to everybody, and if anybody, I won't read through this all, but basically it was looking at deep mapping as a type of critical literary study by placing literary texts on a map. That the placing of the map, the text on the map is in itself a deep map, but looking at the connections between the text is a type of deep map. It's also an exploration, so this is the point that says secondly here. It's an exploration into the extent which critical deep mapping operates as a form of post-criticism. So it's a type of literary criticism that isn't quite as, sometimes I think particular forms of criticism that were powerful and influential in the 90s and in the first decade of this century could be quite punitive, and we're looking at ways to, rightly so in many cases, to sort of pick out faults with texts that had been written before in different types and in different ages. This was a much less kind of judgy way of looking at texts and putting them together and thinking about the way that they operate in a palimpsest, and in ways that are not kind of simply about figuring out the way that, you know, for instance, this is a kind of glib example that Randolph Stowe's autobiographical material that he wrote when he was in Guildford Grammar is kind of a narrative and evidence of kind of outrageous settler wealth no, it's just reductive, and I don't want it to be unpolitical, if that's the word, but just looking at more complex experiences of place and the way that texts pre-exist in or coexist in places. Thirdly, the creation of an accompanying digital map of the texts will elucidate the complexity of human engagement with the rivers and other parts of the more than human world. So it was looking at place as something that was interactive, that was, it had particular type of sentience that were non-human sentience and could interact back and forward with, you know, the human occupants and the non-human occupants. And one really interesting story that came out of this, and I was working with an Indigenous group in the Swan River at the time, was that if anybody knows Tranby House in Maylands, and how if you've ever, there's like a big, go there and have massive cream tea these days if you ever want to check it out. But before we'd managed, or you know, in WA we'd managed our rivers so they didn't flood and ebb so much, that the rivers were much more unpredictable. That Tranby House just kept getting flooded, and they kept moving it back and moving it back and moving it back. And they're like, that's not an accident. Okay, that's the river. And they started, of course, you know, James Sterling started giving out land packages where they all had like really small frontage to the river, and they were like chunks of blocks over, and got a little bit of river and like a big long block to have their farm on, and those blocks kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and they're like, yep. It's obvious. They're not meant to be there. Like, all right, so you can use a digital map as a critical survey in some ways about looking at what kind of texts are located, and what kind of emotions, what kind of ideas and themes are common to particular places. And so in some ways that is a methodological innovation and a resource with useful outputs, because obviously you could make a big map like this available to the public if they were interested to see what was available in their area. But I don't think I'm ever going to get enough money for a big project like that, and so I've just let it go. I just thought, if anyone's here, Tony, Pear, and wants to take on part of that, I'm good with that. I'm quite happy to make connections, or anybody that knows about digital things. You know, it's ACAT. Give me the good stuff. I don't get it. I write things down by hand. So I met this man I've met a lot of fantastic people in Aberdeen in my travels in Aberdeen. Pete Stollery, he makes deep maps through soundscapes. And this is what I'm interested in now, using poems, using bits of poems, using different things, readings from poets or writers that are no longer here, new poetry, new types of simply stories of the river, and having them arranged into audio texts that are deeply immersive in ways that can change the people that listen to them. Maybe in some semblance, or using my own kind of experiences of being changed through this work as inspiration. But this is kind of what Pete Stollery did, and it might not work because of, and it might not work for the people, I'm so sorry, the people that are online. It's not working. Is it working? So it's called the COVID sound map. And he recorded all of these different, if you can see that, these claps for carers. So this is what COVID sounded like everywhere, or many, many different places in the United Kingdom. Okay. My aura is affecting the tech again. So that's the link. I'll leave it because it's not working. But anyway, that's what people have been starting to do, is to use them for sound installations and lots of different things that make you think about sounds in places. So where to now? And I've just, something strange is going on. computer, click outside. To make this into a smaller, got a number of things up here at the same time, a smaller project, that should just say a song of the East. So I'm from the eastern suburbs. I still live in the eastern suburbs. And this kind of place where you see the green, it's just a Google map, coming, the start of the Darling Scarp, of course, on the other side of that is the oldest mass of rock in the world called the Yilgarn Craton, one of the oldest continuous existing chunks of rock, which is of course why it's so mineral rich. And of course, as many of you will know, the side of Perth used to be connected to India when the two continents split. The silt and the sand fell down in the middle, and this is the kind of riverscape of the Perth Basin. But I'm really interested in this littoral zone because it's, there's British work done into this, but it's an edgeland. And it's where a lot of Indigenous people still live, a lot of working class people live, a lot of people that fly in, fly out live. And it still has all of these hidden haptic, quite mysterious places that are part of our everyday experience. And I know them because I've lived there for 40 years. You know, I'm probably a much better deep mapper of Midland and Kalamunda and Belmont than I am of the whole of all of the rivers, which was my more ambitious earlier project. So that's my scaled down version. I'm interested in audio installations that have public facing dimensions that people can use as an app on their smart device, on their phone, and go to a particular place. For instance, there's a place it's a park near Woodbridge House in Guildford that used to be a really important corroboree ground. And it, for 50 years, was then a rubbish tip. And now it's a playground again, and it's a walking trail. So again, out of sight, the strange monster field, haptic just around the corner, a few fields away. Things are there, always there. And this is my ambition, I guess, to make them more visible in the way that we perceive our interactions with place. And I will leave that there.